Maternity hospital is hit during Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk. The UN calls the attack a violation of international law. Elsewhere in Donetsk, 5 people are killed and over 30 wounded in Ukrainian shelling, which local officials describe as the worst since the conflict began.
There was an explosion. I cried a lot. I'm just scared.
We heard a blast and the windows shattered. I looked around and there was blood everywhere.
The NATO Chief suggests Ukraine may have to cede territory to reach a peace deal with Russia, adding the bloc is aware the conflict could escalate further. And New Delhi stands firm against the WTO's restrictions on subsidized agriculture amid growing pressure from the West. You're watching RT International. My name is Peter Scott, and wherever you're joining us from, welcome to 30 minutes of news and analysis. The UN has condemned as a violation of international law a Ukrainian attack on a maternity hospital in Donetsk. Women in labour, among other patients, were evacuated to the basement where medical staff continue to help them as part of the building caught fire. There were no military personnel in that medical facility at the time, but no casualties were reported among the patients. A mother-to-be told us what happened.
Pregnant women and those with their newborn babies are sitting there. Everyone took cover how they could.
Did they manage to find shelter?
We don't know, but most likely everyone managed to.
That's as the city came under some of the worst shelling since the conflict began, according to local officials. Now, quick warning, you may find some of the following images disturbing. 5 people were killed in the attack, including a mother and a child, and more than 30 wounded. That's as hundreds of missiles and artillery shells were fired into the city, with the town's marketplace suffering direct hits. According to local officials, the attacks were at least partly conducted with shells of NATO caliber. RT's Roman Kostov reports from the site of the shelling.
Several people were killed and scores wounded as a result of Ukrainian shelling on several districts of the city of Donetsk. 5 people have been killed, including an 11-year-old boy and his mother, who were at a market. A couple of vendors died there as well. Besides that, a lot of damage to civilian infrastructure in the city of Donetsk. A gas pipeline was destroyed as well as a fuel depot, several houses, multiple apartment buildings, cars. There was fumes of black smoke all over the city of Donetsk on Monday as it was shelled for continuously for a period of at least 2 hours. People were hiding in the basements. Yours truly also was right in the center of the city, and as the shelling started, it was very close to me, so we had to go and hide in the basements as well. People here in Donetsk have not seen anything like that since 2014, as they told us, and here are some of their witness accounts.
I was sitting in an armchair and my husband was in the bathroom working. We heard a blast and the windows shattered. I looked around and there was blood everywhere. I jumped out into the corridor to see what happened to him, but he was okay, thank God.
Were you hit by the shards?
Yes, shards from windows and even from door panels hit me. The doctors checked me over and removed all the glass from my arms and legs, but I refused to go to the hospital. Let those who are really badly wounded go. Another guy was taken to hospital. He was hit in the vein by a shard.
My friend Nastya and I were the very first who ran into the basement. Then there was an explosion. I cried a lot. I'm just scared.
I automatically went down to the basement with my child.
How old is your child?
8 years old. We stood here. We didn't go further inside, and debris fell on us right here. I've come to my apartment, but it's completely destroyed. My child lays on the bed here, sits at the computer. And if she were lying here, we were lucky that we were in the basement. It saved our lives.
While we haven't heard any damage to military infrastructure, it's civilians and civilian infrastructure that was heavily damaged. I'm standing in one of the places where Ukrainian artillery targeted. This is a maternity hospital, very close, very near and dear to my heart and to my cameraman as well. This is where his son was born 4 years ago, and my goddaughter was born here as well. So it's very painful to see what happened here. The shell landed right on the roof of this building. You can see all the windows, the glass has been shattered. The top floor is almost completely destroyed as well. Women that were in this hospital have all managed to go down into the basement to evacuate into the bomb shelter, and fortunately no one was killed or injured right here. I spoke earlier to the head doctor at this hospital, and she said that they will be forced to close this down because it's very dangerous here at the moment, and they will evacuate and they will continue serving women giving birth at a different location because it's just simply too dangerous here. Also, the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, well, he said that this is also very unprecedented, the way Donetsk is being shelled recently, and here is his statement.
The enemy has literally crossed all the lines. They use prohibited methods of warfare. Residential and central districts of Donetsk are shelled. Other cities and towns of the Donetsk People's Republic are also under fire.
Well, this is certainly unprecedented. The whole city of Donetsk was shaking on Monday, but it's not only here that civilians continue to die. It's along the entire front line in the Donetsk People's Republic. People are continuously being wounded and killed as Ukrainian military continue terrorizing civilians.
Well, in response to that incident, the Russian deputy representative to the UN said the shelling was underreported by the Western media, and I believe we can listen to his words now.
Where is Western media reaction? All those BBC World, Reuters World, AFP etc. who were shouting about damage to maternity hospital in Mariupol used by Ukrainian nationalists as a firing position. Ukraine is deliberately targeting civilians. Will we hear a word of condemnation?
I'm now joined live here at the maternity ward with Yeva Bartlett, an independent Canadian journalist who's been covering events in Donbass and Syria for the last 15 years. Yeva, thank you for joining us today. Well, first of all, we just heard from the Russian representative at the UN that this situation is being underreported. You personally have seen this both in Syria and here in Donetsk as well. Your opinion about why this has been underreported by the Western media?
Yeah, I'll also just note it's even the UN itself is underreporting it in the sense that while the UN Secretary General declared it a clear violation of international law, he also described it as extremely troubling. Now, just imagine if this maternity hospital was in Kiev or some other Ukrainian city, he would have used much stronger language, I would say. But the underreporting or the clear non-reporting at all of such bombings is consistent with Western media, corporate media reporting on matters Donetsk and Syria. For example, in 2013, the largest cancer treatment hospital in the Middle East, the Kindi Hospital, was destroyed. It was truck bombed by FSA terrorists, and that was underreported. In 2016, a maternity hospital in Aleppo, the Debit Maternity Hospital, was internally destroyed by a rocket which landed outside and exploded a car. 3 women were killed, many more were injured, and I went to that hospital after the fact and talked with the director, and I saw for with my own eyes how badly destroyed it was, and it got no reporting in the corporate media. The Dara State Hospital was badly damaged, and numerous wards were out of commission because of terrorist bombing and sniping. And again, no Western media reported on this because it doesn't fit their narrative. Their narrative is solely to vilify, in this case, it would be to vilify the Russian forces and the Donbass forces. In the case of Syria, to vilify Russia and Syria.
Well, civil rights attorney Robert Petillo says the media is being weaponized in today's conflicts.
The fact that the Ukrainians are still using things such as the BM-27 Yurgon, one of the least accurate rocket-propelled Soviet-era bombardment tools, shows that they are not interested in simply taking out military targets. They are simply interested in the wholesale carpet bombing of areas with hopes of stemming the Russian progress in the People's Republic of Donetsk. It is unlikely that any Western outlet will make any mention of this at any point in time. Part of the problem with modern warfare is that the media has been weaponized. We saw similar things take place in Iraq and Afghanistan during those conflicts, where only the U.S. narrative was carried on the international stage. It was only 20 years later we found out exactly what got us into those conflicts versus the narrative that was given to the American people. We've seen the similar with the shadow wars going on in Africa and other Middle Eastern countries. So the press has abdicated their place as the fourth estate as being the neutral arbiter, simply giving information. Rather, they are part of the propaganda arm of the military-industrial complex.
As the Ukrainian military continues to suffer significant losses of troops and territory, NATO's chief has suggested that Kiev may have to cede some territory to reach a peace deal with Russia and warned of escalation beyond Ukraine. RT's Murad Gazdiev takes a closer look.
None of us can tell what stage the Ukrainian conflict is in or how soon it'll end. Intelligence agencies and generals in the East or the West, they may have a hint, but everyone's in war propaganda mode. They won't say unless they have something to gain. What we have are indications, a seemingly innocent statement here or there that gives away much more than intended.
Peace is possible. That's not the question in a way. The question is, what price are you willing to pay for peace? How much territory, how much independence, how much sovereignty, how much freedom, how much democracy are you willing to sacrifice for peace? We always see a kind of vertical escalation, more fighting, more suffering, heavier weapons in Ukraine, but escalation beyond Ukraine.
NATO's chief of staff himself has voiced the idea that Ukraine may have to give up territory for peace. This was from the guy whose job is literal Russophobia, to deny Russia at every turn. It's telling. And it isn't just him. The idea that Ukraine isn't going to win militarily, despite the billions upon billions of dollars in NATO guns and missiles and launchers and rockets and drones heaped upon Ukraine. The idea or admission that they aren't going to win this fight is gaining traction.
Mr. President, does Ukraine have to cede territory to achieve some peace?
It's their territory. I'm not going to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. But it appears to me that at some point along the line, there's going to have to be a negotiated settlement here.
We must not humiliate Russia so that the day the fighting stops, we can build a way out through diplomatic channels.
All of this is in stark contrast to what we heard before from NATO leaders when they thought that the thousands of tons of arms that they're pumping into Ukraine would see Kiev victorious.
It's, the sustained and coordinated support of the international community, led and facilitated by the United States, is a significant reason why Ukraine is able to stop Russia from taking over their country thus far.
Our goal is that Putin does not win. Our goal is for Ukraine to be able to defend itself and to be successful.
To restore peace in Europe, we must continue our support for Ukraine. So in its negotiation with Russia, it can decide on the nature of its relations with Moscow freely and not under the barrel of the gun.
Mostly that was wishful thinking. The front lines have turned into a brutal meat grinder. Ukrainian officials have admitted to losing almost 1,000 troops a day, which includes those killed and wounded taken out of action. 1,000 a day taken out of the fight. The question is, how long can Ukraine keep this up?
It's incredibly clear that Ukraine is not winning the war. Now, there's a huge military defeat, but also on the political front as well. The sanctions aren't having the impact that they thought that they might have. So I think this is very important because, what other kind of leverage do they have? And the only leverage they have is to lean on Zelensky and say, listen, to bring about an end to the war and to bring about peace, you're going to have to concede some territory here. And I think really that's, this is the last card that they have up their sleeve to play.
understand Europe and America. Sanctions have backfired to a horrendous degree. There is division in NATO, with some asking, what is the ultimate point of continuing this if Ukraine can't win? What the sanctions have resulted in is a food crisis and a fuel crisis and an energy crisis, and none of those are affecting Russia. Ergo, we may have no idea how long this conflict will last, but some in the West are already looking for a way out.
Local media are reporting a blast in the Russian city of cede, which is 50 kilometres from the Ukrainian border. The city lost its water supply in the incident, and it's unclear whether there are any casualties in the explosion. We'll keep you updated as and when we get further information on that. As Western pressure escalates, India remains defiant amid the World Trade Organization's restrictions on subsidized agriculture. The country's commerce minister says New Delhi won't be pushed around by external forces or bow to threats.
Developed countries signed a one-sided pact to benefit their own farmers before the World Trade Organization was formed. They gave a raw deal to weak and developing nations. India has been fighting for the rights of its farmers and agriculture within the WTO. No one can pressure India. We won't succumb to any pressure.
The Geneva-based WTO set restrictions against exporting state-subsidized crops, saying they lead to unfair prices on global markets. Such subsidies allow Indian farmers to grow more wheat and rice at lower costs. And New Delhi has said it plans to change the policy to support its domestic farmers as well as to protect the country's food security. Now, India has seen recent tensions with the West over keeping its close relations with Moscow amid the Ukraine conflict. It's rejected calls from the US to cut imports of Russian oil, instead increasing purchases, albeit at heavily discounted prices. India is now one of the top consumers of Russian energy, while the US has imposed an embargo on imports of the fuel from Russia. And the US had this to say to New Delhi on its stance.
In my conversations with them, I've said, look, we don't have secondary sanctions, we can't ban your purchases. But as you increase your purchases from Russia, don't go too far, and don't look like you're taking advantage of the pain that is being felt in European households and in the United States.
Earlier, we heard from an Indian political expert who says the US should treat India like an equal partner if it wants to improve relations with New Delhi.
Well, I think one of the reasons why India's been under so much pressure is because the US expected that India, as an ally of the US, which it is, would cut down or would toe the US line on the embargo on Russian oil. But I think what the West needs to understand is two things. India and Russia's ties are historical. India has the sovereign right to do what is in her self-interest. And India has time and again done when some things are justified, for example, with Venezuela, with Iran. It's worked along with the Western bloc. But with Russia, India's energy security is paramount, and India needs to secure herself before moving on. And, you know, it's European countries who continue to import oil and gas from Russia. So I think that India's consumption, though increase, is much lesser than all of Europe. And it is Europe that first needs to reduce their purchases before they can lecture India on what India is doing with regards to Russia. The West has to deal with India as an equal partner. And an equal partner it has to understand what are our constraints, what are our restrictions. We are with the West, but at the same time, we cannot spoil our relationship, which is traditional friendship with Russia, who's been a friend and who's been with us through thick and thin. It cannot cut out its oil import, jeopardize its energy security, just because, you know, the Western countries may have a problem with A country, B country, or three countries. I mean, at some point, India has to look at her energy security, which is paramount to her. I again repeat, India has 1.4 billion people. India's energy security is paramount.
And over to China now, where President Xi Jinping has signed an order to strengthen the country's military preparedness. The move comes amid rising tensions over Taiwan. And the order, which contains 59 articles, is designed to, quote, safeguard national sovereignty and regional stability. China alleged the US is causing tensions in the region and creating an atmosphere of conflict and confrontation. US President Joe Biden warned earlier that Washington would respond militarily if China does attack Taiwan. Earlier, Beijing's defense ministry said the country would fight to prevent the island of Taiwan from seceding.
If anyone dares to split Taiwan from China, the Chinese military has no choice but to fight at all costs and take all necessary measures to crush any attempt by Taiwanese separatists to split Taiwan from the motherland. The Chinese military will resolutely safeguard national security and territorial integrity.
Well, last month, the White House launched an initiative to strengthen American economic ties in the Indo-Pacific region with more than a dozen countries, but China was excluded from that initiative. Independent China analyst Andrew Leung gave us his thoughts on Beijing's military moves.
If you look at the statement itself, it deliberately says there's nothing to do with war. It is just preparedness. The military operations, military operations short of war. In other words, getting the military personnel and also installation of equipment and also military assets ready in case the war breaks out, because there is tension. This is not the first time that Beijing has issued these kind of guidelines. But this time it is very significant, warning the United States not to hollow out the promise of the one China principle, because although the United States keep on saying that they honor the one China principle, and on the other hand, the United States is seen to be doing all sorts of things, trying to hollow out this promise, trying to promote Taiwan's independence.
As consumer prices continue to rise in the United States, President Biden is trying to alleviate pressures on American households and shifting the blame onto oil companies and, of course, Russia. This comes as his approval declines among key voters and many of his fellow Democrats begin to lose faith in his presidency.
Biden's old line about everything being Russia's fault isn't cutting it with Americans.
Inflation is a real challenge to American families. Today's inflation report confirm what Americans already know. Putin's price hike is hitting America hard. It's outrageous what the war in Ukraine is causing.
He is growing less popular by the hour. The latest numbers show Joe Biden having a 20% drop in popularity among voters aged 18 to 34 from January 2021 to June of 2022. Now, it's important to note this is the group that got Joe Biden to the White House to begin with, having a big turnout. It's not hard to understand why old Joe is so unpopular. He seemed to promise an economic rebound, but it never happened. At this point, America is facing the highest rate of inflation in 4 decades. Gas in the United States is up to $5 per gallon. In addition to that, you've got the mass shootings that took place in Buffalo and in Texas, and the gridlock when it comes to guns. It's pretty clear Joe Biden is not steering the ship in a good direction. You could expect Republicans would jump all over him, but now, with numbers this low, we've got folks on the Democratic side of the aisle turning on him. The New York Times let the cat out of the bag, revealing that they interviewed 50 elected officials who are Democrats, and all of them are deeply concerned about the rising strength of the Republicans. They say that Biden should not run in 2024 because it would be handing them an easy victory.
To say our country was on the right track would flagrantly depart from reality. Biden should announce his intent not to seek re-election in 2024 right after the midterms.
If the president has a vision, then that's something certainly we're all willing to entertain and examine when the time comes.
That's not a yes.
Should he run again? I think that I think it's. We'll take a look at it. Okay. But right now, we need to focus on winning a majority instead of a presidential election.
The presidency is a monstrously taxing job, and the stark reality is the president would be closer to 90 than 80 at the end of a second term, and that would be a major issue. He looks his age and isn't as agile in front of a camera as he once was.
Midterms are coming up in November, and at that point we could see the U.S. Congress shift based on how voters decide to respond. However, after that, Biden will still have 2 years to possibly turn things around. Regardless, there are many, even within the Democratic Party camp, that are at this point saying it might be worth just throwing in the towel and finding somebody else for the job. Caleb Maupin, RT, New York.
And finally, nuclear reactors in the US could see outages next year or earlier if Russia decides to stop the export of enriched uranium. That's according to the American news media outlet The Hill. The plants generate about 20% of the electricity in the United States, and this potential Russian response to Western sanctions could lead to serious problems in the US with the operation and maintenance of its power plants. Unplanned shutdowns of these nuclear facilities could result in blackouts and further increases in electricity prices. Russian officials claim if the US were to ban Russian uranium, it would only harm the US itself. Now, Russia controls 40% of the global uranium conversion infrastructure and 46% of global uranium enrichment capacity. Earlier, we spoke with Professor of Economics and Politics, Dr. Jack Rasmus, who thinks a US embargo on Russian nuclear fuel would heavily impact the EU as well.
There are some nuclear plants in the U.S. that do import Russian nuclear fuel. If that is embargoed, no imports from Russia, then the U.S. and those plants are going to have to scurry around elsewhere in the world to try to get it, and that's going to create excess demands elsewhere and drive up the price of that particular product, and therefore drive up electricity generation from nuclear. And because all these fuels are substitute products, what we call them, when one goes up, the other goes up, drags it up. Oil and natural gas, the same thing. If you find nuclear costs going up in the U.S., well, that will have an effect as well on other fossil fuels to some extent. So the big question, though, in my mind, is not whether the U.S. embargoes it. It can scurry around and get some supplies elsewhere. But what about Europe? A country like France, for example, 70% of its electricity generation comes from nuclear plants. That will have a big impact on France. And I don't think France would go ahead with banning imports of Russian enriched processed fuel from Russia. That's going to be a little different than oil. France might be a new Hungary when it comes to nuclear embargo.
Well, those are the main stories this hour. Head over to rt.com or our social media pages for more. I'm Peter Scott, and thank you for watching.